So we're the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and this is the Alaska office. A quick thank you to our funders. So ICC was founded in 1977 by Eben Hobson Sr. From Barrow, Alaska, with the idea that Inuit needed to come together with a common voice to address common concerns. So today we represent around 165,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And I just wanted to put that part out first to say a little bit about ICC for those that aren't familiar, just to give some context to why we were doing this project. These are the type of international engagements that ICC is involved in. Before, when we tested this, there was a bit of a lag in the slides. So does everybody see an international engagement slide now?
Yep.
Yes,
I think we do.
Okay, thank you. So for my office, our main engagement is the Arctic Council. And of course, all of you are familiar with the Arctic Council, but we've found recently in talking to federal agencies is that they weren't familiar with permanent participants. So just to quickly show, the Arctic Council is made up of 8 countries and 6 permanent participants, and ICC was actually heavily involved in the formation of the Arctic Council. So Sami Council, RIPON, and ICC were already formed, and then as a result to the Arctic Council, the Inuit International, Gwich'in Council, and Athabaskan Council were developed to further represent Indigenous peoples within the Arctic. So we're at every single level within the Arctic Council. Our bosses are with the senior Arctic officials. And then for technical staff like me, we cover the working groups. So for myself, I cover the conservation of Arctic flora and fauna. We are given a mandate every 4 years, and right now we're working under the Fitzcarralk Declaration. And that's when all of our leadership from all 4 countries comes together to say what we need to work on for the next 4 years. For the last 8 years, food security has been the top of that mandate. And then coming back into Alaska, our Alaska membership, our regional membership organizations make up our board, and they further decide what the priority in Alaska needs to be. And for the last 8 years, they have also said that the top priority is food security. So just a quick explanation also. In Alaska, we often use the term Eskimo, but because it's not such an accepted term in Canada and Greenland, our leadership made the compromise in 1977 to use the term Inuit. But just for those that aren't familiar, here in Alaska, we're referring to the Nupia, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Central Yupik, and Chupik, and so this map shows an overview of all the of the 4 regions that we advocate on behalf of. Okay, so then getting over to the food security part of it, please just stop me if you have any questions too. So we started this project because our leadership were going to tables, going to having discussions with people and talking about food security and about the impacts that we were seeing on our food security. And what they quickly realized is that the people sitting across from them were talking about something different. They were talking about pieces of our food security, but not the overall view of what we were encompassing when we say food security. So a good example of this would be in Alaska that people use the term subsistence a lot, but the term subsistence is a legal term and doesn't encompass everything we're talking about. Internationally, often focuses on purchasing power and nutrients and calories, and again, those are really important, but not everything that we were talking about. And so when we were looking at this and also considering how much increasing interest is occurring within the Arctic to do assessments and how much information we all need to know, and quite often our people kept telling us that we needed to look at things through a food security lens. And so it became more and more apparent that we really needed to explain what we meant by a food security lens. So the first part of that is explaining what the Inuit food or Inuit food system actually is. And we couldn't find one. We couldn't find an Inuit food web, so we drew one. This one has a crazy, scary fox on it that we can't get rid of. You'll just ignore that one. But this, if you look at this picture, then you see that there's multiple different components that are making up the Arctic ecosystem, from sharing food to cutting up food to preparing food to dance to feast, along with fish and phytoplankton, marine mammals, chemical elements, all of these things. The best way that was explained, and I think I've shared this with this group before, is when an elder explained to me that the entire Arctic is like a puzzle, that there's all these little pieces that have to be put together to understand what was happening. And these pieces include language, and another piece could be culture, and another piece can be salinity levels. But the point was that all of these pieces have to be fit together and adjusted to understand what is actually happening in the Arctic. And this is where this was a really good way of explaining what our leadership was seeing at the table of there were only pieces being discussed when they talked about food security. But it was also when we heard people using other terms, when they talked about even just understanding biodiversity, they were only looking at pieces. And from an Indigenous knowledge perspective, we needed to look at all of it together. We need to see this whole image with all these pieces and understand how they're connecting in order to understand those other issues that we would classify under food security, but people also refer to as biodiversity or other terms. So looking at this puzzle, it's really helpful for scientists to think that each of these pieces can be considered a system, because it's very similar to system science, and then that's what Indigenous knowledge is saying. So take each piece of that puzzle. Culture is a system that is interconnected with oceanography, with the system of oceanography, and so on and so on. So we set out to do this project, and the project covers all 4 regions and is put together by 164 contributing authors. They're all 146 contributing authors. They're all Inuit, all Indigenous knowledge holders. And that was a really key part about this project is we used Indigenous knowledge methodologies to do the project. And so this project also gave us the opportunity to explain that Indigenous knowledge does have its own methodologies, and there was a lot of concentration put on monitoring. There was a lot of comments from all of the Inuit involved about the need for monitoring and the need to recognize that Inuit have their own methodologies again. And so this, the technical report gave us an opportunity to explain that. But the overall objectives were to develop a definition of Inuit or Alaskan Inuit food security, identify drivers or causes of food security and insecurity, and then to create a conceptual framework that would be able to guide us through an assessment process. This is just the first line of the definition, but I think all of you have access to the executive summary and also the reports that you could see the full definition. It's a bit of a long definition because we're talking about all of life. So this very first line is that Alaskan Inuit food security is the natural right of all Inuit to be part of the ecosystem, to access food, to caretake, protect, and respect all of life, land, water, and air. The key part here is, again, showing that culture is part of the ecosystem. It's not something separated out. So then we needed to create the conceptual framework. And again, the conceptual framework is used to be able to help us see how concepts are interconnected and to communicate that out in order to guide through an assessment process. So what we have here is an image of a drum, because the drum is very important to us. So we start with food security and then surround that with what it's characterized by, the 6 dimensions of food security. And the 6 dimensions were created through the drivers that were identified. There were 57 drivers identified, and then those drivers were broken into the 6 dimensions. Surrounding that are the tools needed to obtain food security. Surrounding that is the spirit of all that is within the Arctic, and then holding it, then the handle is holding it all together. And once we fill this in, you'll see that this is all of Indigenous knowledge, because Indigenous knowledge isn't like saying, oh, I'm a biologist or I'm a chemist, right? It's encompassing multiple things across both spiritual beliefs as well as understanding of the environment. So here we have it filled in, and this is always amazes me to see this because it took us 3.5 years to come up with this. But that's what happens when you're working with 146 contributing authors, I think. So in the center, we have food security, and surrounding it is environmental health. That means that our food security is characterized by environmental health. And here it's important to remember again that when we say environment, when we say ecosystem, we're encompassing everything in that. And so these 6 dimensions are what make up environmental health. That's availability, Inuit culture, decision-making power, management, health and wellness, stability, and accessibility. And I would encourage, we don't have a lot of time today, so I'm not going to go through what each of those terms mean, but I would encourage all of you to look at the reports because we can't assume that we're saying the same thing. And that's the whole reason why we started the Food Security Project. For example, when we're talking about health and wellness, it's not specific to human beings or specific to animals. It encompasses everything from water to land to animals to plants to the mental stability of Inuit. Surrounding those 6 dimensions are the tools that we need to maintain the 6 dimensions, and that's policy, true co-management, and knowledge sources. The knowledge source part, again, was really stressed firmly because it's believed very firmly that we need both Indigenous knowledge and science to better understand the environment and the rapid changes that are occurring. Surrounding the drum, or holding it together like sinew, is the spirit of all. And here you see the name written of Spirit of All in the 4 languages from the 4 regions that we advocate on behalf of. And holding the drum up is food sovereignty. And this is true of every single culture, every single country, that without food sovereignty, food security is not going to exist. This is a very important part of it. The thing here that the contributing authors and advisory committee really stress is that if any part of this drum is not there or is unstable, food security will not exist. So, again, that just takes us back to the whole idea that we have to look at everything holistically and all together, that all of those points, all of those pieces of the puzzle have to be looked at to understand what is actually occurring. So I mentioned that there were 58 drivers of food security and insecurity that were identified, and here are just a few of them, because it can be a little bit overwhelming. I know there was quite a few people that came back to us saying, how can you have 58 drivers? But I think this, again, is what Inuit here were trying to communicate, is that we're talking about interlinking systems. And so we're really looking at cumulative impacts. And in order to do that, we have to understand what different drivers are, but also how those drivers are interlinked with each other. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with these different drivers. So you see both good, both not good, but it's not meant to be good or bad. It's pretty neutral, but they are having negative impacts. So, for example, if we look at loss of sea ice by itself as a driver isn't as much of a threat to food security or creating instability in that dimension of stability until it's combined with other drivers. So once it's combined with user conflict or lack of decision-making power, things like that, it starts to become a much more stronger threat to food security. So also the contributing authors developed these conceptual maps to try to help show where these linkages are, especially because Indigenous knowledge is really paying attention to relationships between components. I realize you can't see this very well, so I split it up into 2. So this one has to do with sea ice coverage, thickness, and sea ice formation and breakup. And you just see what it all means. If there's a decrease in sea ice coverage, there's a decrease in accessibility to hunting. So hunting strategies are changed because more time is required, and hunters have to travel further distances, which increases fuel use and other resources. but it also means more unsafe conditions. It also changes food web dynamics. So elders are telling us now that benthic species are moving due to change in stratification within the water column because of change in sea ice coverage, which also causes change in things like ugruk and walrus. This is the other side of the overall concept map. So we can see a decrease in thickness of ice is thicker. This one is, I'm sure all of you heard about what was happening on St. Lawrence Island this last winter, where the ice got jammed up and nobody could access the walrus, and then it got moved out very quickly because everything melted very quickly and nobody still could access the walrus. This has an impact on both the humans and the walrus. And this is where this will be the last conceptual map that I show here, but this is to show how this is all interlinking to the walrus as an example. Now, for indigenous knowledge, they wouldn't normally just put the walrus right there in the middle, but they did this to help explain to people outside of the culture how it is that they're seeing what these relationships are between the components. So here you see the 6 dimensions, but you also see, and you see how that all is interconnected between these relationships. But an easy way to tell the story is to understand that when a young boy is being taken out to start to learn how to hunt walrus, they're being taught their language and they're being taught how to recognize the environment that they're around, but more importantly, they're being taught to recognize how they're part of that environment. When they come back with the walrus meat, they have to give their first catch to an elder, and at that point they become a provider as opposed to being provided for. This is a strong point of self-identity. Lots of other community activities occur surrounding that, such as processing and sharing and storing of the meat. But also when that child is being taken out there, they have to really understand the connection between the sea ice thickness, the benthic species, the water currents, and the walrus all together. So it's all these multiple variables that have to be considered that leave us with the idea that in order to consider walrus health, you have to consider the health of everything else also. And that's pretty much the overall findings of it. I think for here in Alaska, the strongest driver, according to the 146 contributing authors, the strongest driver to food insecurity right now is lack of decision-making power. So, of course, climate change is having a huge impact on people, but also people believe that if they were able to use their traditional management mechanisms and allowed to use their indigenous knowledge along with the science more frequently, they would be able to adapt much better than what they're being allowed to now. And that's everything. So, Koinapaluk.
Thank you, Carolina. That's great. And those diagrams are really helpful. I think they're going to make a big impact in a lot of areas. That's really very useful. Comments from folks?
I have a quick question. This is Laura Kahn. What fraction of the, I'm just interested how much of the Inuit diet is protein, and of that protein, how much of it is caught, wildlife caught?
So we didn't do those type of breakdowns. I can say that we do see benefit to those type of statistics, but we're also concerned when they're taken without a complete context, because oftentimes it doesn't show preference, right? So just because somebody's diet might be lower in ugruk, it's not because they want it to be lower in ugruk. It could be a number of factors that are causing it to be lower in ugruk.
Sure. Well, in an ideal world, what would the Inuit preference protein source? Would it be primarily wild caught?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so, well, as I'm sure you're aware, with the climate change that, you know, the protein, the animals are probably going to be challenged as much as the humans. So it's not clear how sustainable that source is going to be.
Well, I think it's a good point that the world is changing, but also Inuit are here for the last 10,000 years because they've adapted to a world that was changing. So
sure.
I think that the point here, again, is, you know, this is coming up really frequently right now because of the possible uplisting of Walrus. And the possible uplisting of Walrus is based off of future projections of habitat. And we all know the habitat is changing, right? So that's quite a concern. But as opposed to addressing the human activities that are actually causing a change in habitat, it's on the table to decrease hunting activity.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There's a positive feedback loop that exists between people that are engaged in their environment, and disrupting that positive feedback loop is not good for the environment any more than not decreasing carbon outputs, right? So if we see that as the most stock example of that is in the Niger Delta, when people's fishing sources were overly polluted, and then they were overly regulated, not allowed to access the fish, and then from there, within a couple of generations, they lost their knowledge of how to engage in that environment. So there's quite a lot to be said through the idea of conservation through use and these other type of concepts that are found within Indigenous knowledge that if they're allowed to be used, I think that it's going to put a lot more context to the conversation of how sustainable things will be, or
right.
will be.
I just have one last question, and has there been any discussion on the pros and cons of aquaculture to try to have a more stable food supply?
There's a lot of conversation about, I mean, there wasn't conversation about that in context of this project, no, but there is a lot of conversation about that. I'm not sure that I'm being completely clear here, that there's a risk to food security to cutting the cultural part of it out. And by bringing in things like aquaculture, there's a potential to do that. So I think if that's what Inuit decide to do, then that's one thing. But there's also, within Indigenous knowledge, quite a bit of concern about over-managing the environment or over-changing it.
Sure.
So I think down in Southeast, there's a lot of interest, and there already exist clam beds and things like that. Nobody likes the idea of Franken salmon at all. Mm-hmm. Everybody's pretty freaked out about the idea of farming any kind of salmon because they get out into the wild. I think there's a concern with over-manipulation of things in that way. There's a lot of greenhouse gases, or not greenhouse gases, but greenhouses and growing vegetables and things like that.
Yeah, I think that one of the other issues is that the Inuit environments have been affected by a lot of outside activities, whether it's, you know, Yankee whaling in the old days or pollution coming into the Arctic regions now. And I think that there's a lot of feeling that, you know, a lot of the regulation stuff that's happened has not been really designed from an Inuit point of view, but they'd often suffered from the imposition of policies that weren't very well suited to their particular needs environment, or the fact that they weren't the agents that were really causing problems to the animal populations and so forth.
Yeah,
Carolina,
go ahead.
Carolina, this is Margaret Herzog with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We hear much of the same things you mentioned, and we were wondering how Observers Network might be a way to unite different cultures facing these same problems, to unite through your organization, such as ARCIS with the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook CWO. Do a lot of your members, do you know if they find that useful as a way of organizing the information that they find throughout the Arctic? And also we use the local observers network as well as other ones like ILOCAs that find a way of bringing the Indigenous together so that they can troubleshoot these problems as a larger unit. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you take a look at the reports, there's a long list of recommendations that are underneath each of the drivers. I just want to say that I really quickly I agree with what Bill said, and I think that's a strong point here of this presentation and also the project, but also that the overall well-being of the entire ecosystem is believed to be suffering because of some decisions that weren't made right, and that's the part where it's so crucially important at this point to engage both Indigenous knowledge and science to get the right information, which I think goes into the monitoring part of it. So a huge recommendation out of this report from the contributing authors is the need to increase capabilities, networking capabilities across Indigenous organizations, and that's specifically so they'd be able to share information with each other. So I think there was kind of a couple of things that you mentioned there. For SIO, I hear a lot of positive stuff for SIO. People like to use satellite data to take a look at leads and things like that. They like to use it and use their Indigenous knowledge for interpretation of their actions using those types of tools. So I think very much. For ILOCA, SISONet under ILOCA is a really interesting project that really looks at starting to be able to allow hunters to put in the observations that they would naturally be making under their Indigenous knowledge methodologies. And that's really important because oftentimes we're asking two different questions between Indigenous knowledge and science, which is good, right? It's really good that we're asking those two different sets of questions, but we need to find a way for both of them to be there. So I think, Peter works on this quite a bit with data management, but there's a lot of questions that need to be addressed as far as how to categorize information, how to share the information, how to safeguard the information, and even how to establish community-based monitoring programs that are based more off of a co-production of knowledge as opposed to communities feeling like they're being used. So the more that we're able to bring people together, the better those things are going to be worked out much stronger, I think.
We're going to have to move on because we've got a bunch of other stuff we got to do, but thanks very, very much. That was great and good discussions and questions on that topic, too.